How many of you are watching TV? Did you watch TV this morning? Did you watch some local news? Have you watched TV even recently? Do you have a cable subscription? Do your parents have a cable subscription? Do your parents have a cable subscription, but do you ever watch it? If you live on your own, you have an apartment, do you have a cable subscription? Therefore, what media are you actually absorbing? The bigger answer that most of my students say is that they haven't watched cable in years. Many of my colleagues, they haven't had cable in years. And so, what are we watching? I have a sense that my own family, we are watching constantly our own programs on our own iPads, and we are off with our headphones on it. So it's very rare that we watch anything together. We might be in the same room, but we're always watching our own programs. Now, recently I said to a family member, I said, hey, I'm going to buy you a TV, and you can just push whatever you have on your phone through a Chromecast onto that TV. And then we came back and we said, well, do you even need a TV? Can't you just buy a monitor for a very small amount of money, and you could just push that amount to the monitor? And then eventually the family member said, well, no, I don't care about you getting me a monitor, even though it's a big monitor. Put it on. I don't care about that. I'm just happy with my phone. And my thoughts are, how did we get to that point? We have changed that landscape of media quickly. Does every technology move that fast? The answer is no. We've been able to see this. I think every 10 years you'll see a meaningful shift. But many of the same historical tensions still exist, even though we've changed our ways a little bit. So this lecture, I'm going to have this, is really about some of the historical pieces that are behind technology that is frankly there, even though technology is supposedly creating a new world. So I want to kind of back up and tell a larger story of Western civilization and then get us to the now, where we are working through brand new ideas, but we have ancient ideas that are still very much in play. I'm a big fan for you all to watch Steve Blank's The Secret History of Silicon Valley, which is a wonderful YouTube film, and Mr. Blank is very generous in his use of filmic content to really show where Silicon Valley really begins as a defense contractor. And you have wonderful Harvard professors who are moving to the outskirts of these California suburbs, mostly in the Bay Area, where they are engaged in mostly radar and electronic warfare projects that, frankly, were a big part of the U.S. victory in World War II. And it's important for us not to begin the discussion of history in World War II, but to understand World War II as an important meeting point for many historical forces that are very ancient in European history, in American history, in Asian history, and that are coming forward in one powerful set of years that is giving us that gave us the building blocks to what we have now, which are creating yet another world. But Mr. Blank is very clear that it begins in this kind of post-World War II era, that you have the beginnings of the American Silicon Valley. You have these veteran radar engineers who are moving to California and creating the very beginnings of kind of a U.S.-funded, government-funded series of electronics companies that is giving us the modern defense electronics industry. So a great film that I'd recommend for you to follow up on. That's given me a lot of understanding. Now, as I sit in Starbucks and I absorb my daily flow of news, I see other projects that are coming to great fruition. One of them is Hadrian X, which is an Australian company that uses a robot, a large robot automated crane that will build suburbs. It will build houses. And you can see the beginnings of the digital design. You can see in 2 or 3 days, they take an architectural blueprint and it stacks bricks in a perfect grid and of course you end up with rows of homes. So it's a very affordable way for us to create a suburban infill where families can be housed. And this is an image from Saudi Arabia where Hadrian has a contract to develop massive housing throughout the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Very interesting. Now, the Saudi Arabian kingdom wants to create a city that is a Silicon Valley replica, something similar to Silicon Valley, but is engaged with 3D printing, robotics, artificial intelligence, the future of global industry. And, the Americans created this template for how that's done, where there's a bit of government funding that get things started, but then there's, of course, the room for entrepreneurs to create new innovations. And it's schools like ours that feed talented entrepreneurs, engineers, and business people into that environment. I've followed this project, and now it is at a very smooth and highly refined position where now there's a stock float. Their stock is up 20%. Since I developed this lecture. I did 10 cents. So I recommend maybe picking up some FBR stock, but you can see the premise for Hadrian. And so I could say, yes, here is Hadrian and just worship Hadrian and that's all. But we need to be a little bit better at that because frankly, a person in high school could simply look at a news feed and could follow these trends, but they may not necessarily know whether this trend will follow into the future. They may not know whether to buy this stock. The answer is you should. But they may not know where this trend is heading. Should we care? What is the shape of this trend going to be in a few years? And how should one be positioned as a young college student vis-a-vis this kind of renaissance merger of digital design, robotics, fluid mechanics, finance, etc. And so what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where the roots of these American economies came from, what makes America distinctive, why we are doing it here, what role leave you to answer, well, where will we be in the future? And I want to begin by talking about Hadrian, by talking about Eli Broad. Eli Broad is a very prominent member of Los Angeles business community and is one of the founders of Kaufman and Broad, or KB Homes. I imagine if you drive to Las Vegas, you'll see what K&B does. They build large tracts of suburban infill. And Eli Broad is one of the initial innovators of this way of building very habitable, very decent family houses. And of course, they occur in lanes or streets, and there is very same assets across all of these. And LA became one of the great, in the 1970s, became one of the great purveyors of this suburban lifestyle. This is South Central Los Angeles. It is rich with these early Broadian homes, and LA was a perfect place for this to be done. So in many ways, the project of suburban infill was a great project that was done in post-war by people like Eli Broad. And this is a good image right here. I like these big image pages. This is a very good image right here of how these tracks are laid. Now you can only imagine how Hadrian will kind of happily fill the place of the massive workers' corps that are necessary to make these places. Now, will it be adequate for just robots to do this work? And the answer is no. You'll need huge numbers of people in order to even get a technology like Hadrian working properly. Naturally, we need people who will keep these machines working, and we'll need massive armies of financial people to get projects like these underway. But I think what we can say is cool laser, keeping Hadrian on task. What we can say is that this is going to change the way that we assign human labor. The bricklayers see this as a threat. And I think that even traditional residential corporations like Eli Broad's may even see this as an interesting trend that they may need to adopt and relate to. But it's an interesting world that you all will inherit. But that's just the 20th century. We can see these same strategies used by Tesla, where one could doubt that one could make a new automotive company here in America, but one would be wrong because Tesla is an all-American made product as of now. There'll be a future. The mass production will take place in China, but these important prototypes for automated robotic delivery are all done here, where I believe this is the Sunnyvale factory. What a gorgeous place. Let's do a field trip here and let's see the KUKA robots render a Tesla. KUKA is a wonderful company. It's popularized by it's German corporation, I believe, that delivers these highly dexterous, highly programmable robots whose hands resemble those of a human being. And these hands have a certain anatomy that enables them to do the kind of skilled manufacturing that people are known for. Now, will they destroy American jobs? Well, what they will do, and this is a good example, is they will create jobs for people who are willing to train to maintain these robots. That's for sure. So we've seen that within the IT economy itself, where the rooms full of people typing has been replaced by lawyers and others who can simply type on their own. Frankly, instead of there being jobs in typing, there are the women who typically would have been the typists are now lawyers. Law is a 50% male-female industry at this point. So we definitely see an interesting future. I'm not sure if you need to be afraid of this. Some people are very afraid of it, but I'm not in the business of telling people what to think. I'm more engaged with having you think about things. But we can see where this early Silicon Valley, this very empty place, becomes eventually a vast hub that is of great historical consequence right now. I don't believe that we would be having a class such as ours if it were not for the beginnings of this place. And frankly, Silicon Valley is a very friendly place for there to be innovation. Right now, it's a very expensive place. Simply the value of what gets done here. But in the day, Silicon Valley was a fairly out-of-the-way, very cheap place for this kind of development to get made. It's an important historical message to put across. So what I want to do is I want to venture back in time just a little bit into the 1600s, roughly the 1650s and the late 1600s, where there was the country of France. France was largely a kind of a very undeveloped area with no distinct boundary between Spain, where there are great colonial armies, and then the Dutch Low Countries, such as Amsterdam and Holland, where there were very developed pre-capitalist societies, where frankly it would have been the Dutch that were sailing ships around the world, and it would have been and funding those overseas shipping explorations. It would have been the commercial innovations happening on behalf of the Dutch, and then it would have been the Spanish who were moving up the backbone of France in order to invade the Low Countries. And so the Dutch had to experience season after season of Spanish invasion as they were the military superpower. And then what the Dutch eventually did is they adopted fortress production so that the Spanish would leave during the winter and they would arrive in the spring, and there would be these bastion environments that would be atop each hill. And so gradually the Dutch established their own country. This bastion and fortress production was beginning to take place in France with the arrival of Louis XIV. And eventually there would be matrices and environments of fortresses that would come to define the French people's border. And there were these borders that were created, and I calculated there's roughly 650 miles that would characterize the major bastions of farmable agriculture, which when taxed would create a very consistent supply of revenue for the new emerging monarch who would otherwise be without revenue in this situation. So the pre-modern France would come from the Vauban bastion network, and which would eventually give us the lines of the Louis, and eventually would give us a Napoleon, which would be a influential military leader. So you cannot have a Napoleon without first there being a Louis XIV. You could not have a Louis XIV without there being a Vauban. And a Vauban is primarily focused around creating bastions or superior protected cities. And it's a wonderful piece of French heritage. You'll see instances of these in coastal South Carolina and Florida. I spent a lot of time taking satisfaction in studying how these were built. Of course, they were built so that there would be multiple layers, and if you were in an army advancing, you would have to contend with a small number of skilled marksmen atop these sharp bastions. They would triangulate fire, and they would be very low. So they would be a post-medieval construction. They would not be very high. There would be nothing for an invading army to shoot at very accurately, and it would be hard to dig under it and root it out. And meanwhile, the population could live with some security inside. And so this is the way that France was formed as a country. And so very, very, very interesting. It's these networks of architectures. Now, this gives way, naturally we create an aristocratic class that can capitalize in these ventures. And what would happen is the Dutch would form this mercantile class that would, to some extent, compete with the revenue of the military monarchs. And the new emerging class would be this global set of travelers who could, create maritime adventures and then could capitalize and fund them back home. So we have the modern bourse, or the modern stock market, as formed by the Dutch. Now, this would be a very important idea coming forward as we establish new countries abroad, such as in America. You would have these sailing companies that would raise great amounts of money, that would open up whole new shipping and distribution environments across the world. Of course, it would take a month to convey traffic from one port to another, but it would open up whole areas of the world to global distribution, to the great ancient European powers that were coming under their own. The European powers would have competition from others. So just a quick map. These are the Portuguese colonies in China. And this is the way that the small nation of Portugal would arrive at an incredibly influential global trade. And these are not projecting well. But this is a way that the West would open up these trade routes. Here's little Portugal opening up the vast wealth of China. And then China, of course, having to deal with the arrival of Western powers that would dominate it, and it would take it by surprise, as many of the Latin American and African countries and Indian and Arab countries would be surprised by these militarized European economies that would arrive, that would have these rather developed economic shipping lanes via ocean. So the British would have a profound kind of impact in these kind of Asian empires, and would be trusted to do shipping amongst them. So this was a very interesting arrival of this kind of globally distributed European free market-based culture that would be originated in these capitalized shipping industries. Now, this would be important to distinguish, because when we look at cities such as London, really there are two Londons. You have the City of London, which is really the heart of these financial mechanisms, but you also have the Bank of England, and you have all of the important financial work that's done here in City of London. And this is completely distinguished from London. So London is actually a city, but City of London is a city unto itself with its own mayor that is separate from London. And this would be an interesting sort of historical fact, because the City of London is, there's very few large buildings, but the transactable capitalism that happens within the boundaries of the City of London is roughly equivalent to that of New York City, which is very interesting. Just this idea of centralized markets that are really where the world comes in order to transact. It's an important kind of leftover. Now, the Americans would begin with this kind of revolt. I'm not sure if a revolution is the proper word for it. I've heard it described as a war, the War of Independence, but eventually the Americans would push away from the British ownership, the British colonial ownership, and would have the freedom to establish their own kind of society. The English, of course, would have these important sort of cameral legislatures that would influence the Americans. We would have our own organized government that would be separate from it. But I want to go back to this because there is this important dynamic between what the government is doing, what the government deems legal, the financial vehicles that they can use to convey and establish companies such as a Hadrian or a Tesla globally. And so when we come into the modern era, I want to just talk about what we have done here. This American experience has given us these certain, I don't want to say privileges, but has given us a certain willingness for global capital to fund ventures here. So we have a Silicon Valley that's characterized by the Twitters, the Googles, the Facebooks. There is tremendous international global capitalism that has financed and capitalized these new ventures. Of course, after our experiences prevailing in military conflict, of course, on a global basis, we have this interesting mechanisms here, Silicon Valley, where you can get tech that's frankly not equatable anywhere else. Other countries would simply have to steal this material or have it given to them in order for them to possess it within their bounds. But I want to begin by talking about the computer, and I want to talk about these machines that were created here within that kind of post-World War II context, that post-war Pax Americana context. You have this idea of the computer, which is a British idea. It's an idea of capturing language and of processing language. But the post-war digital electronic environment could give us this ability to represent words using ones and zeros, and those ones and zeros could be turned on with electrical impulses that would be embedded in circuits. So if I could power the circuit so that this combination of ones and zeros could turn on, we could render numbers, which could eventually render words. And given that technology, we could then have words that could be searched for, and that we could store the words. They were initially stored on punch cards, such as they were during the British and American World War II experiences. And then eventually we could have the ability to make programs that would use logic against the words that were stored inside of the machine. This is, of course, assembly language. And assembly language would enable the first programs to be built. So, for example, an example application of this kind of language would be to say, take 25 million American males and to have them have data compiled on each of them. For example, how many push-ups they could do, how many words they could read in a minute, how many words they could pronounce and spell correctly, how many years of school they finished. We could capture an almost unlimited number of data points about those military-age males, and then we could discern, well, if they wanted to be a communications specialist, they need to be able to do this number of pages. They need to have this many years of school. If they want to be a combat infantry, they need to be able to do this many push-ups. They need to be able to run the mile in this amount of time. And so out of that, the governments of Britain, and especially that of America, who did it better than anybody else, could selectively construct teams of individuals who would be optimally suited for their military vocation. They could be bridge builders. They could be flight traffic controllers. They could be pilots. They could be ammo handlers. They could be recruiters. They could be media agents. These many, many roles, we could use a program to search for those individuals and eventually populate a functioning army. So really, the Americans using language like this could craft a more sophisticated, more capable army on a per-person basis. Now, Germans also had interesting computers. They had computers themselves. They had radar that was comparable to us. Now, and if we leave that war and we enter into the 60s, we begin an era of government financing of projects. One was DARPA, the Defense Agency Research Projects Administration, which would form a network of computers across America that would enable the government to maintain communications with itself should there be a nuclear attack. And if the U.S. was somehow disabled, differing locations could pick up the slack. Now, these are the locations that we were aware of, but these were the academic institutions tasked with designing an ARPANET. And eventually, more institutions would be added to this, and there would be more nodes that could share communications. So, for example, USC would be added, where the domain name system would be maintained here in Marina del Rey in a little building. And eventually other colleges would join this environment. And so this would exist in America. You know, this is a map of 1977. This is simply the progress that it had made by 1977. Now, other innovations would follow. Steve Wozniak, of course, the famous partner of Steve Jobs, his initial innovation was to create a keyboard that would allow people to type a character, and you could then see the character on a screen. And so that brilliant electrical engineering innovation enabled for people to type language such as the assembly language, and then for people to be able to look at the code on the screen and to potentially debug that code as it moved through. So he was a great support to the computing culture in this way. And so Steve Jobs' role was largely to evangelize the Wozniak innovation. Wozniak was not hungry for the limelight, but he was especially devoted to the technical perfection of it. And a lot of Silicon Valley history is formed by this early partnership. I love how Woz is just staring at the machine, and Jobs is looking outward at what could be done here. But I think Jobs understood the philosophical importance of what Woz was doing, and was a person raised in the Silicon Valley area and understood the kind of business opportunity that you could have if you were to popularize the computation culture that Silicon Valley was frankly very good at. So this is an important lesson for the young student who is comprehending the philosophic value of a technology. Is really they need to become a nearly religious evangelist of what these things could do. Now, Steve Jobs was looking outward at the world. He was seeing the worlds of industrial design take over things like automobiles, things like furniture, things like spoons, things like bowls, and they could say, well, this initial computer will have to have more personality than what we have going on. It needs to be something more convincing than this. So he's credited with introducing industrial design to kind of double the impact of this interesting keyboard and screen combination. Now, what you're seeing here is the combination of the mouse, which would be an innovation by Xerox PARC, which was initially a wooden block that could move around and could show you, like what I'm doing right now, the pointer as it moved across the screen. Now, if you were to think about the emerging standard of the internet as it would commingle with this emerging culture of PCs, you have some powerful combinatorics that are emerging. Now, this would be something that would take place with even these early PCs, where if you turned it around, you'd see that there would be a phone jack in the back. And if you had understanding, like for example, if you're a physics student, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to download large matrices of data, such as spreadsheets and text files related to physics experiments that were happening elsewhere. One of it would be Microsoft Windows that would make this a friendly experience. Non-Mac computers could run Microsoft Windows. Of course, this was built in natively to each Mac, but Microsoft was successful in taking that software from Apple and releasing it on their own. And that would create a separate computer industry where software would operate on its own, independent of Jobsian hardware. Windows 95 is credited with introducing the web browser or Internet Explorer, and that meant that roughly by 1995, the realization of a consumer internet where e-commerce was a possibility, people could send an email to each other, there would be the ability to look at web pages, and having that internet experience embedded into the strong personal computing environment around Windows was now a possibility, but really it was that Windows 95, that sort of brought the Internet Explorer to the world. Now, the Internet itself was meant to be conceived of as a kind of a space where you would utilize HTML or a hypertext markup language to produce websites, and therefore the content of websites would have themes and ideas, and that they would have meaning unto themselves. It was the work of a researcher at the CERN, or the European Nuclear Research Program, where an individual named Tim Berners-Lee would theorize and build up the ability for web pages to be characterized by their content based upon their writing or their markup. And so later he would be, really this idea would be validated for companies that would come later. But let's talk a bit about that consumer internet. Steve Case was one of the first great entrepreneurs in the consumer internet space, where by forming AOL, or America Online, AOL became very popular, and it merged with Time Warner as a massive internet/content organization right around 1999. AOL's scale by 1999 would be historic. But interestingly, AOL was formed a year after the Apple computer went public in 1983. AOL was formed as early as 1984, before it became the juggernaut that we understand it in 1999. Now AOL is not a major presence. I believe they're largely a holding company for other internet properties. They're still very much a player. But frankly, the year of 1999, we believed that AOL would certainly capture this integrated world of entertainment, media, and internet. It was an early foray of doing this. Now, if I could take a step back, I want to talk about another important personality in the 20th century internet, which is Sam Walton. Walton, you know, to be the founder of Walmart. He specialized in building kind of goods, all-purpose, all-around general goods stores in rural Arkansas. His idea went as far as 2 stores before it went bankrupt. And in his bankruptcy proceeding, he told the judge that he intended to return, to go to college for the first time and to receive a degree at the University of Arkansas. The judge granted him a bankruptcy where he could return to school and that his company could remain in his possession as he paid off its various debts in a Chapter 11 proceeding. And under this arrangement, he attended University of Arkansas. This is 1980, if I'm not mistaken. In 1980, the idea of computerization was very prevalent at University of Arkansas, and very similar to our college here. University of Arkansas was proselytizing a future based upon computers that were small, that could be located in a store, a computer that could capture the progress of inventory as it's sold using a simple database, and then potentially joining that single computer to matrices and networks of other computers, and therefore could enable a whole new kind of corporate organization. Well, Sam Walton, the enterprising young person as he was, took that idea, imbued it into the bankrupt Walmart at the time, and went forward with paying off his debts and then forming the third Walmart store in rural Arkansas. But again, why wouldn't an idea such as the personal computer connected to the internet serve the demands of an entrepreneur such as Walton, who was trying to serve a democratic idea, low-priced goods, across communities that were underserved and that had a lack of services, and that could frankly benefit from and glom onto the idea of an all-in-one vendor. And so this idea of providing services across a geography in a unified, networked, coordinated way, it served all the dimensions that Walton needed to stage the development of Walmart. So Apple's IPO would come very soon after Walton, where in 1983, and of course, we were understanding the new kind of businessization of Silicon Valley. Jobs would step down for a more mainstream CEO to take place, and he would soon lead the corporation afterward and go for a long foray elsewhere before he would return in roughly year 2000. So by the time that this IPO took place, it was coming very close to the time for Steve Jobs to leave, and he was eventually alienated from the early Apple. That's another story. Now, in the beginning with a similar period, another computing company called Sun Microsystems was taking root across town north of Apple in San Mateo, I believe, where the Unix, or the Unified Network Information Exchange, which was perfected at UC Berkeley, and it was learned by a Berkeley graduate by the name of Bill Joy, would be formed into a company to form industrial strength network servers and personal computers. Sun Microsystems would join forces with a collection of other entrepreneurs. One would be Vinod Khosla from India, and Andy Bechtolsheim from Silicon Valley. I believe this is Bill Joy. He looks different. And then Scott McNealy would be a Harvard Business School graduate. This quartet of young people made a cohesive company that would supply industrial-grade servers based upon that network information exchange, otherwise known as Unix, that was fundamental to these computers. Now, what was happening at the same time is that Microsoft was engaged in becoming one of the most valuable corporations on planet Earth, certainly one of the best-known brands on planet Earth. It was eradicating its competitor Apple. It was making Apple a place where even its founder, Steve Jobs, could not inhabit its halls. But also, Sun was an important place for the development of new executives, one of whom, Eric Schmidt, was working on a project known as Java. Java was attempting to make Microsoft systems obsolete by creating what's called a runtime, where a person could write code, and that code could be distributed without being rewritten across an unlimited number of computing frameworks. So Schmidt's project was to develop Java to the point that it could be a strong industrial component, and certainly one of the major value-added pieces of the Sun Microsystem Corporation. So Sun could, the Bill Joy operating system could deliver this highly networked Unix operating system, incredibly resilient, very hard to crash, very efficient, completely internetworkable. And then, of course, Schmidt's Java project. Schmidt was not the coder of Java. He was simply the project manager and the executive overseeing it. But then Java could be inserted into a Bill Joy Unix machine, and therefore a piece of software could be written in a financial center, such as New York, and it could be distributed across the topology across any number of computers, and then that would work across both the Sun machines of different versions even, and the Microsoft machines, and a Apple machine if one wished. So it was a vision of a distributed, collaborative, internetworked brand of software. So Schmidt would get his first kind of prominence based on his work at Sun. Now, naturally, Sun was suffering with competition with Microsoft, which remained an incredibly ferocious competitor. And Sun would eventually be bought by Oracle and subsumed under Oracle. But at the same time, the prominence of Microsoft was running it into trouble. Gates, as successful as he was running into the issue of simply being too powerful, and of the idea of bundling Windows Explorer was simply creating issues because it could prevent other web browsers from occupying space in the Microsoft desktop. Now, Microsoft made the case that you needed to run Internet Explorer in order to benefit, in order to create full interoperability and to create the real dream of Windows, but it was destroying competition. And Silicon Valley was becoming at odds with its northern cousin up in Seattle because this single technology upstart was frankly better at reaching the consumer than the hobbled Apple or the industrial-oriented Sun. And the American consumer was making a Microsoft its operating system of choice, and Bill Gates was in fact becoming a gatekeeper of sorts to the entire computing industry, eliminating other Silicon Valley startups. Now, when you fool around with the offspring of the federal government, i.e. Silicon Valley, you will end up gathering the ire of those stakeholders who have a vested interest in seeing Silicon Valley succeed, which is wide and deep. And so Gates, as good as he was, became embroiled in an antitrust that would eventually force very small cosmetic changes. Simply, Microsoft would be forced to bundle its software differently. But because Microsoft was running in so many state, local governments and so many government agencies, the sheer volume of lawsuits eventually forced Microsoft to slow down in its approach. And this would take place right around year 2000. And that would coincide with a recession that was beginning to happen within the tech economy. Now, the small browser company that Microsoft tried very hard to alienate was started by a man by the name of Marc Andreessen, who was a Nebraska-born, Stanford-educated, kind of a Renaissance man. He understood a great deal of the technicalities of programming, had a great deal of the grasp of the programming languages, and wanted very much for the internet browser to act as a kind of a software compiler. And it eventually created one of the most competent web browsers by the name of Netscape. The Netscape Corporation was also implicit with the formation of what's called Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, which was one of the first enablers of e-commerce. So it was the SSL that was designed and perfected at Netscape that enabled many of the e-commerce companies to succeed. So you had an eBay several years later because of the SSL encryption that was developed at Netscape. Now, I'm happy to be corrected. I'm basing this entirely on my own understanding. But Andreessen's little Netscape would be hobbled by the Microsoft Windows 95 juggernaut, and that many of that talent would be dispersed, and there would have to, unfortunately, the case against Microsoft would be based primarily on its aggressive repression of Andreessen's Netscape. So, unfortunately, sometimes by the creation of various enemies, you create your future. Unfortunately, Marc Andreessen, as a Stanford grad, as one of the kind of the sons of Silicon Valley, by trying to dismantle his corporation, it really hampered Microsoft in the future. It's something that I think should be taught in business schools, that tolerating competition is a way to stay afloat amidst other competent practitioners. Now, had Netscape simply been allowed to have their browser within Microsoft's Windows 95, and had they been able to freely develop without Microsoft's actions against them, Microsoft may have held on to its dominance longer. Now, what happens next in the saga is that a series of Stanford graduate students involved in computer science degrees began to produce Google, which was a search engine that would combine the work of many servers working together to index and to create a searchable index based upon the meta tags or the content of web pages. So in many ways, the Berners-Lee idea of a semantic categorizable internet would come to fruition in the Google research project. Now, the Google students set up shop across the street from Stanford with one Google machine. And I think the rack, it's fun to look at what they initially built, because they crafted their own computer, and then eventually they would gain the financing from many Sun Microsystems founders to go live with this. Also, the CIA would inject capital through their Q-Intel investment arm, which was a traditional investment corporation to stimulate Silicon Valley corporations. But the work of these two enterprising graduate students would have ramifications going forward. Brin and Page would be capitalized during a relative low watermark of venture capital in Silicon Valley as the dot-com economy of the late 90s began to implode. Corporations such as Amazon, Pets.com, theglobe.com, AOL began to falter as Wall Street began to massively discount their newly IPO'd shares. And so this corporation somewhat rose from the ashes, not indifferently from the way that a Vauban fortress would rise from the ashes of medieval fortresses destroyed. Now, Brin and Page were trying to arrive at a way that information could be categorized, and the internet as it stood with millions of nodes across the world could be converged into a single rational searchable index, so that, frankly, we could ask questions of a computer and locate the most relevant answers based upon an algorithm that would categorize the authority of given pages, otherwise known as PageRank. And so Page was, and this was his initial graduate school investigation, which was, how can I make a program that would study all of the hyperlinks that backtracks from a certain page. So you have a page, but what other pages reference this page? And it was called Backrub initially, and it was intriguing, and it gave fuel for thought to the other researchers at Stanford's existing information retrieval research program. And so that strong philosophy of the B tree, or a binary tree index, would help to fuel the creation of a custom set of computers that could store information about other web pages across the world, and then could render answers when someone would say, what is the most authoritative page related to mowing the lawn? How does one mow the lawn? Now, the initial Google engine would be set to work on all the web pages in Stanford University. And so with the many research and published papers that was stored on the Stanford University website, Google was allowed to be the public search engine of Stanford. Stanford would say, hey, we have something you do not. We have a search engine. You can find stuff within our webpage. Type it. And so that was that was a quaint yet muscular early version with respect to these two graduate students. Now, as Google would IPO, and as it gained venture funding, Eric Schmidt became, I think, employee number 4 or 5. He was asked to pony up $1 million of his own money in a famous set of negotiations, and he was kind of asked to be its initial CEO to help guide this nascent company through the intricacies of the Silicon Valley world. So Schmidt was an early executive where there were very few employees early. Now, I want to say a bit about, I want to go in a different direction. I want to talk about the founders of Hotmail. Now, the two founders, one of whom, the most prominent of whom was Sabir Badia, was a Caltech educated engineer, and his idea for a distributed email environment attracted the interest of Bill Gates. It was purchased, I think, by $200 million or something tremendous, and it became the de facto email apparatus for Microsoft. We use the latest incarnation of it today as we use our Outlook, but Hotmail provided an interesting way for us to create a web-based or a web page that would load in a web browser that would give you access to your email messages. This was interesting because we could simply touch those emails from anywhere where we logged in. It didn't require software. It could just run over HTML, which was the native language of the internet. And so there were two innovations. One, it was its client-facing HTML experience, and then two, it would be its data center background where all of your mail would presumably be stored. Now, we had to create efficiencies on the back end, back in that data center, so that we could have machines that would be responsive, that would provide value easily, and so it participated in this interesting mixture of professionals in Silicon Valley that would later be absorbed into Google, that would be about the data center. And it would create an interesting, vital linkage as we move from local pop to cloud-oriented services. So at that turn of the century, we would also see these large data warehouses, as they were called, which are large combinations of computers that would work together, that would have databases, that would share large volumes of data. You'd see this used particularly a large amount of skill by the grocery chains. These would be the competitors to Walmart, and what they would do is they would mandate that their customers would have membership cards, and then they would connect the sales activity on behalf of each member to inventory, and they would study the progress of their inventory to the point of sale, and it would create an interesting analytic called market basket analysis, and it would be an interesting way that grocery stores would study consumer behavior within the boundary of their store, and it would later lead to the more intelligent configuration of the floor plan of the grocery store. It's not a mystery that things that people typically buy in a grocery shopping session usually are organized at opposite ends of the store, therefore allowing you to walk between places and gather interesting things that reach your attention. This is a very standard historical practice on behalf of grocery stores. Frankly, if you don't have any ideas about what to do for this term, I recommend that you embrace grocery stores, because they're something that you know a lot about, and they are vital, burgeoning industries, and there's a lot of competition and creative destruction going on within them. Now, the grocery store would be particularly important because it would have, frankly, demographic shopping data on almost every American, and large chains such as Walmart or Vons or Stater Brothers or IGA, what have you, would have access to the economic capacity of every American household. And so this idea of data warehousing would have a lot of ramifications moving forward. Now, as we reach 2000, we have the electoral face-off between the Democrat Al Gore, the Republican George Bush. At the time, we remember the controversial outcome of the election. George Bush wins the election by a vote count. The results were delayed by a month. for the American president. We haven't had anything quite like that, but that took place in that election. But instead of talking about the outcome, I want to talk about the way that the GOP arrived at that victory, and it was through purchasing a copy of all of the grocery store consumer data, compiling it into a large data mart, or data warehouse, data mart, called VoterVault, and leveraging that list of names and addresses and consumer preferences in formulating an electoral strategy that would result in block walkers, or a person walking the block and talking about issues specific to that block. And you can see that same strategy at work today in the presidential election campaign on behalf of Ted Cruz, who utilized a similar big data strategy. And you could see this now with the GOP victory. That put incredible pressure on the Democrats. The Democrats were an electoral minority in all houses, and there was a predominant GOP supermajority for the vast majority of George Bush's tenure as president. The Democrats came back 8 years later with the prevalence of social media, and so they approached that same block walking paradigm, but from a digital social media perspective. But before there was social media, there was VoterVault. Before there was VoterVault, there was the data warehouse on behalf of the grocery stores. And so this idea of big data, it is characterizing the way that we do big business, politics included. Now, if I can take a quick back tour, big businesses like Hotmail depended upon the successful use of server hardware, similar to what Sun Microsystems was making. The biggest problem to Sun Microsystems was the emergence of the Linux operating system. Sun Microsystems was famous for protesting even the existence of Linux, claiming that Linux is a PC variation of Unix, where a person running your laptop could install Linux on your laptop. And it was a community of open source enthusiasts all over the world. It was a very interesting project, but it's of great fascination here today. But Linux created immense difficulties for very high-end Unix dealers such as Sun Microsystems. And that data center culture of Silicon Valley very much wanted for there to be a free, highly scalable, stable version of the Unix operating system that was already open source by Berkeley BSD, that could be available for data centers in the newly burgeoning data center culture of Silicon Valley. So in order for there to be a Hotmail, you needed to have a large number of computers operating successfully, efficiently, behind the scenes. Linux served that very, very well. And let's talk about that for a moment. Now, let's say that you had a copy of the Linux operating system moving on this computer. You could actually install a similar copy on another machine with some software that would allow them to use each other to serve up the same computational task. Most of the time, it had to do with serving up access to data with the newly emerging traffic on websites such as Hotmail, eBay. And so when you were to cluster a single version of Linux together, they could begin to work as a team to collectively deliver uptime or the lack of crashes for a website. So these clusters were very, very important innovation to making e-business services something that you could depend on, something that could be on 24 hours of the day. And of course, these were important advertisements from this e-commerce culture that we were trying to make in Silicon Valley. So the Linux cluster was incredibly important to these e-businesses. Now, eventually, the Linux clusters would become clouds. Clouds really are these combination of servers that are working together, and that when we access a cloud, we feel like we are talking to one computer, even though there could be hundreds or thousands of computers behind the scenes with a common software that was making the servers work together. So the cloud is a unified experience where many machines work and feel like you're working with one machine, and often the complexity of that data center is hidden from the user, and sometimes it's hidden from the developer who wants to build code that he or she deploys across all the servers and can feel like a single experience. So when you talk to Twitter, when you dial up Twitter and you use Twitter, you feel like you are getting constant uptime. And of course, in the early days of Twitter, there would be the famous fail whale, or there would be a warning that, sorry, Twitter has crashed right now. These very popular internet services had to learn how to stay up despite the quadratic level of demand for them. Everybody at the time had to get an email account. Everybody at the time wanted to get a web page. Everybody at the time wanted to look at CNN's website or a New York Times website. So we had to arrive at a way to get constant uptime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this video right here. I'm going to create a part 2, so to give you a chance to stretch your legs, and that will be coming in just a moment.